Most men never hear this truth, and most women never admit it, but the reality is far harsher than it seems. Many women who move quickly in relationships, chasing excitement, chemistry, and validation, often end up facing consequences alone. And it's not about blame or morality, it's about patterns, choices, and the invisible psychological forces that shape relationships. If you've ever wondered why some women repeatedly find themselves raising children on their own, what you're about to hear will explain the truth that most people ignore. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the insights that most people will never talk about. There is a pattern many people overlook because they only pay attention to the surface. The fast chemistry, the thrilling connection, the immediate intimacy. But beneath that surface is something deeper and far more revealing. Impulsive attachment is often rooted in emotional gaps that haven't been addressed, and these gaps shape decisions long before consequences appear. When a woman forms intimate bonds quickly, it isn't always because she feels a deep, meaningful connection. Sometimes it's because the pace of the connection creates an emotional shortcut, a temporary way to feel wanted, seen, or validated without truly knowing the person she's connecting with. The rush becomes the substitute for stability, and feelings replace clarity. This is where the pattern begins, long before the relationship becomes complicated or long before motherhood enters the picture. Impulsive attachment rarely starts with someone thinking through the long-term possibilities. Instead, it starts with a feeling that feels powerful in the moment. The attention is flattering, the chemistry is exciting, and the closeness is intoxicating. But chemistry and compatibility are not the same. Chemistry can create illusions. It can make someone believe the connection is stronger than it truly is. And when decisions are made inside that illusion, they tend to be emotional rather than intentional. People move fast because slowing down forces clarity, and clarity can be uncomfortable. It exposes red flags. It reveals mismatches. It removes fantasy. Many women who form bonds impulsively avoid slowing down because slowing down means facing uncomfortable truths about themselves or the person they're with. In this impulsive state, boundaries become blurred. Standards become negotiable. Decisions around intimacy become faster, looser, and less grounded. Emotional hunger takes the wheel. And when emotional hunger is driving, outcomes are unpredictable. The desire to feel connected overrides the need to evaluate who that connection is forming with. The relationship speeds ahead with little structure or intentionality, creating a fragile bond built more on feeling than foundation. When a bond is fragile, it collapses under pressure. And pressure always arrives eventually. This is where the path towards single motherhood begins. Not because of immorality or labels, but because the relationship was built like a house on sand. When a connection forms impulsively, when it wasn't built with stability in mind, it rarely has the resilience needed to survive real challenges. Once the initial excitement fades, reality steps in. Reality asks hard questions. Are you two compatible? Are the values aligned? Was there ever a real plan? Is there emotional maturity on both sides? Was the intimacy grounded in commitment or in momentary desire? When these questions appear, the relationship often reveals its weaknesses, and the emotional bond that once felt unbreakable suddenly feels fragile, unsteady, or completely undone. And when things collapse, the responsibility rarely falls evenly. The excitement that fueled the connection disappears, and what remains is the aftermath of impulsive decisions made without long-term vision. Many women find themselves carrying emotional consequences, practical consequences, and sometimes parental consequences alone. Not because they intended this outcome, but because impulsive attachment creates relationships that burn fast and end hard. The rush at the beginning becomes the weight at the end. What makes this even more complicated is that impulsive attachment is often tied to internal wounds. A person searching for validation, reassurance, or emotional closeness will attach quicker, trust quicker, and give quicker. They aren't connecting for the sake of connection. They're connecting to fill something within themselves. And when the inner wound is driving the connection, the relationship becomes less about compatibility and more about emotional survival. This leads to choosing partners who feel familiar, rather than partners who are stable, partners who trigger excitement rather than partners who provide commitment, partners who fill a void rather than partners who help build a future. The pattern repeats because the wound repeats. Impulsive attachment is not about labels or judgment. It's about the inner psychology that drives quick intimacy and unstable relationships. When the bond forms too fast, without clarity or evaluation, it becomes vulnerable to collapse. And when the collapse happens, the consequences rarely spread evenly. The emotional gaps that created the rush in the beginning become the emotional burdens carried later. And this cycle continues until someone slows down, faces themselves honestly, and starts building connections with intention rather than impulse. Short-term decisions carry a power most people never realize until the consequences arrive. And this becomes especially true when impulsive attachment turns into impulsive intimacy. What starts as a moment driven by feelings, excitement, or validation often lays the foundation for years of emotional and practical responsibility. The transition from a fast connection to a complicated reality doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, subtly, as short-term thinking builds long-term outcomes brick by brick. The emotional high that once felt harmless becomes a path that shapes the future in ways no one intended, especially when clarity is missing and decisions are driven by the moment rather than the vision ahead. The pattern ties directly to what happens in impulsive attachment. When a connection forms quickly, the emotional momentum leaves little space for reflection. Short-term thinking takes over because the present moment feels louder than the future. The attention, the intimacy, the chemistry, they overshadow the questions that actually matter. Is this person responsible? Is this person reliable? Can this person provide emotional consistency? Is there alignment beyond the physical pull? These questions are rarely asked in the heat of a fast bond. The moment becomes everything, and future consequences feel distant, unreal, or irrelevant. But time always brings the truth forward, and the truth doesn't soften just because the initial excitement felt good. Short-term intimacy often carries hidden long-term commitments. Modern culture encourages the thrill, the spontaneity, the live-in-the-moment mindset. But biology, responsibility, and real-world consequences don't operate on that mindset. When intimacy happens with someone who hasn't demonstrated commitment, intention, or stability, the risk of long-term fallout increases dramatically. Not because the woman planned for it, not because she wanted it, but because short-term choices don't negotiate with long-term realities. The body doesn't care about emotional impulsiveness. The consequences don't pause to consider whether the connection was built with intention or just emotion. Life simply responds to actions. This is why so many women who move through relationships quickly find themselves facing outcomes alone. Not because they deserve it, not because they intended it, but because they made decisions in moments where the future wasn't part of the conversation. If the foundation of the relationship wasn't strong enough to survive conflict, pressure, or responsibility, it won't be strong enough to handle the demands that come with parenting, emotional accountability, or long-term partnership. A bond built on excitement isn't strong enough to carry the weight of life, and when the excitement fades, the reality that remains falls heavily on the person who invested emotionally the fastest. Short-term decisions also distort perception. When someone acts from impulsive desire, validation-seeking, or emotional hunger, they choose from a place of need rather than wisdom. Need creates blindness. Need makes someone tolerate instability, overlook red flags, or underestimate the importance of commitment. And when commitments are not established, responsibility is not equally shared. The partner who was never grounded in long-term thinking is usually the first to step away when life becomes difficult, leaving the other person facing the consequences of decisions made under emotional fog. But the deeper truth is this: short-term decisions aren't just about the relationship. They reflect a lack of inner grounding. When someone doesn't fully understand their needs, boundaries, or long-term vision, they are more likely to make choices based on how they feel in the moment. And when the moment is driving the choices, the outcomes will always be unpredictable. The woman who attaches impulsively, who chooses intimacy quickly, who prioritizes emotional gratification over evaluation, isn't intentionally creating future hardship. She is simply responding to internal wounds or unmet needs. But wounds don't think about the future. They think about relief. And relief is always short-term. This creates a cycle where temporary satisfaction leads to permanent responsibility. The quick attachment leads to quick intimacy. The quick intimacy leads to a fragile connection. The fragile connection leads to a partner who is unprepared, unwilling, or unable to stay when life becomes challenging. And the person who moved fastest emotionally becomes the one who bears the weight once the relationship collapses. The short-term decisions write the long-term story. The brutal part of this truth is that most people don't recognize the long-term consequences until they are living inside them. They look back and realize the signs were there. The instability was visible. The mismatch was obvious. But in the moment, the feelings were louder than the facts. And when feelings lead, consequences follow. The long-term reality becomes a mirror reflecting the short-term choices that once felt harmless, exciting, or innocent. This is why understanding the psychology behind impulsive decisions is crucial, because without awareness, the same short-term thinking will continue creating the same long-term outcomes, repeating the same cycle without anyone realizing how predictable it truly was. Attraction is powerful. It pulls quickly. It feels natural, and it creates the illusion that two people are deeply connected even when they barely know each other. But attraction alone has never been enough to sustain a long-term relationship, and it has never been enough to withstand real life. When decisions are made on the basis of chemistry rather than character, the relationship is built on something temporary. And anything built on something temporary becomes unstable the moment pressure, responsibility, or reality enters the picture. This is where the connection between short-term choices and long-term consequences becomes undeniable. Because the same impulsive patterns that created the bond now determine how quickly it unravels. When someone moves fast because the attraction is strong, the brain exaggerates connection and minimizes risk. The emotional impulse says, "This feels right," even when the logic hasn't been consulted. The attraction produces confidence, excitement, and urgency. It makes someone believe the other person is special simply because the chemistry is intense. But chemistry often reveals very little about who someone actually is. It doesn't show responsibility, emotional maturity, future vision, self-control, or stability. It doesn't show whether the person will stay when things get hard. It only shows that the moment feels good. And when intimacy is chosen based on this feeling alone, the bond lacks the scaffolding needed to survive anything beyond the moment. This ties directly to the pattern of impulsive attachment. A fast emotional bond built on attraction creates a sense of closeness that hasn't been earned through time, observation, or intentional evaluation. Without knowing someone's character, values, history, loyalty, or stability, decisions are made that assume the relationship is stronger than it actually is. Attraction creates false certainty. False certainty creates reckless decisions. And reckless decisions inevitably lead to unstable outcomes. When a relationship is not built on shared values, tested trust, or mutual direction, it becomes vulnerable the moment life demands more than chemistry. The instability becomes glaringly obvious as soon as responsibility enters the picture. When attraction fades, and it always does, because the brain cannot sustain infatuation forever, what remains is the truth of who each person actually is. Suddenly, the differences are louder. The incompatibilities are clearer. The red flags that were ignored at the beginning now feel impossible to overlook. The partner who once seemed irresistible now seems unpredictable, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable. And when the bond is fragile, the relationship begins to fracture the moment pressure appears. Responsibility is the ultimate filter. It reveals who stays and who disappears. A partner who is chosen for excitement rather than stability rarely has the capacity to handle long-term commitment. If they were never grounded, never consistent, and never forward-thinking, they won't become those things simply because consequences have arrived. Attraction creates closeness, but stability creates commitment. Without stability, commitment evaporates as soon as life demands more than pleasure or convenience. And when that commitment evaporates, the weight of the situation falls on the person who invested emotionally too quickly, too deeply, or without evaluating the partner's long-term capability. This is how unstable relationships lead to outcomes where someone ends up carrying responsibilities alone. Not because they planned for it, not because they wanted it, but because they mistook attraction for alignment. The bond was never built to last. It was built to satisfy an emotional or physical need in the moment. And a bond built for the moment collapses as soon as the moment passes. The stability required for parenting, partnership, or shared responsibility simply wasn't there from the beginning. It wasn't tested, it wasn't proven, and it wasn't prioritized. But the deeper layer to this truth is that attraction without stability often stems from the same inner wounds mentioned before. When emotional hunger drives choices, the pull toward intense attraction feels like fate instead of a psychological pattern. People choose excitement when they lack grounding. They choose intensity when they lack security. They choose validation when they lack self-worth. And when these internal gaps guide romantic decisions, the relationships formed tend to be chaotic, unbalanced, and short-lived. The person who feels the attraction most intensely is often the person who becomes the most vulnerable when the relationship collapses. Attraction is not the enemy. It is natural, powerful, and necessary. But when attraction replaces evaluation, when chemistry replaces character, and when feelings replace foresight, the relationship becomes a ticking clock. The moment life demands structure, commitment, or responsibility, the bond built on excitement cannot handle the weight. And what began as a thrilling connection transforms into an unstable situation that someone must navigate alone, shaped entirely by decisions that were made when the heart was louder than the mind. The choices we make in relationships often reveal more about our internal state than the external world. When excitement is prioritized over character, decisions are filtered through desire, validation, or adrenaline, rather than through assessment of long-term compatibility. This dynamic is particularly relevant when attraction feels intense and the emotional pull is overwhelming. The thrill of newness, the high of attention, and the rush of physical intimacy create an illusion of connection so strong that deeper considerations, values, responsibility, reliability, are pushed aside or ignored. Choosing excitement over character may feel natural in the moment, but the consequences ripple far beyond the immediate gratification, shaping the trajectory of life in ways that are often unavoidable. Excitement is a temporary state. It gives a sense of urgency, makes a person feel alive, and convinces them that the connection is rare or special. But excitement has no mechanism for sustaining commitment. It has no tools for navigating stress, responsibility, or adversity. Character, on the other hand, shows itself over time, through consistency, accountability, and the ability to handle challenges. When character is overlooked in favor of immediate gratification, relationships are constructed on shifting sands. The foundation is fragile, and any stressor, financial, emotional, or logistical, reveals the instability that was already present but hidden by the thrill of the moment. The cost of prioritizing excitement is often invisible at first. Decisions made under the influence of emotional highs rarely feel risky or consequential. The emotional state masks practical realities, whether the partner is reliable, whether they share long-term goals, whether they can provide stability. The connection may feel deep because feelings are amplified, but amplified feelings cannot replace real alignment. Over time, the difference between temporary thrill and enduring character becomes undeniable. The bond that once seemed unbreakable begins to show cracks when faced with responsibility, disagreement, or the challenges of daily life. This imbalance, excitement over character, also impacts the long-term outcomes of parenthood. A connection chosen for thrill rather than reliability may falter when children enter the picture. Parenthood demands accountability, consistency, and shared effort. Those qualities are rarely assessed or prioritized when decisions are made purely for immediate gratification. When the bond collapses under the weight of responsibility, the person who valued excitement most intensely often finds themselves navigating the consequences alone, left to reconcile the gap between what felt good in the moment and what life actually requires. The pattern repeats itself when emotional needs are unaddressed. Individuals who prioritize thrill may unconsciously seek partners who reinforce existing internal wounds. People who are exciting, unpredictable, or unavailable. This creates a cycle where short-term desire continuously overrides long-term vision. Each connection offers validation and intensity, but none offer stability. The deeper emotional patterns, attachment to intensity, fear of grounded commitment, or unresolved self-worth issues, continue to drive decisions, making the consequences of choosing excitement over character feel inevitable rather than accidental. Even when a person recognizes the mismatch, disentangling from it can be complicated. Emotional attachment forms rapidly when excitement dominates decision-making. Letting go of a thrilling connection is not just a matter of logic. It is a battle against the brain's chemical reinforcement, the emotional investment, and the perceived loss of what felt so intense. This resistance prolongs engagement in relationships that lack foundational character, increasing the likelihood of outcomes where responsibility, parenting, and emotional labor fall unevenly. The thrill becomes a trap rather than a gift, and the short-term reward becomes a long-term challenge. Ultimately, choosing excitement over character is a decision that prioritizes emotional highs over sustainable alignment. It is a choice that makes short-term validation feel urgent while obscuring the long-term costs that will eventually arrive. This pattern explains why impulsive attachment, chemistry-driven bonds, and unassessed partners often result in unstable relationships. When excitement is the driving force and character is secondary, the outcome is rarely shared stability, mutual responsibility, or enduring partnership. The consequences, particularly when parenting is involved, are often unavoidable because life does not adjust to the thrill, only to the reality of choices made in its pursuit. The key difference between relationships that survive and those that collapse is not chemistry. It is character. Character is what sustains a connection when the initial thrill fades, when responsibilities emerge, and when challenges test the bond. Choosing excitement over character may feel natural, irresistible, or unavoidable, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is measured in outcomes that affect the trajectory of life, relationships, and long-term responsibility in ways that momentary highs could never have predicted. At the core of many impulsive decisions and patterns in relationships are unresolved emotional wounds. These are the silent drivers behind choices that prioritize excitement over character, chemistry over compatibility, and short-term highs over long-term stability. Emotional wounds can come from early experiences, past relationships, abandonment, or repeated feelings of inadequacy. They create a lens through which every connection is filtered, shaping perception, judgment, and decision-making in ways that often go unnoticed until consequences arrive. When these wounds remain unaddressed, they lead to repetitive cycles that mirror past pain, recreating the same patterns and outcomes over and over again, regardless of conscious intention. One of the clearest ways emotional wounds influence behavior is through the search for validation. A person who feels incomplete, unseen, or unworthy may be drawn to relationships that provide intense emotional or physical attention because it temporarily fills the gap. These relationships feel thrilling and affirming, giving the illusion of completeness. But the validation is temporary and conditional. Once the excitement fades, the unresolved wound remains, ready to guide the next impulsive decision. This is why the same patterns repeat. The heart seeks what temporarily soothes the pain, not what builds long-term stability. Without addressing the root cause of the wound, the cycle continues, creating situations where unstable outcomes and unexpected responsibilities, like single parenthood, become more probable. Emotional wounds also distort perception. They can make someone misread signals, misinterpret intentions, or overlook warning signs. When a person has a history of emotional neglect or abandonment, they may subconsciously gravitate toward partners who reinforce familiar patterns, even if those patterns are destructive. Unconsciously, there is a sense of comfort in chaos because it mirrors internal experiences from the past. This means the person might choose partners who are exciting but inconsistent, thrilling but unreliable, creating a repeated pattern of unstable relationships that eventually lead to difficult consequences. Each choice feels different on the surface, but is connected beneath by the same unresolved emotional landscape. These wounds also affect decision-making in moments of vulnerability. Impulsivity often emerges when the emotional brain is in charge, and unresolved pain makes someone more likely to act on immediate desire rather than long-term foresight. The pull of chemistry, the thrill of intimacy, and the temporary relief of validation become magnified because they promise to soothe underlying discomfort. But emotional healing cannot come from external sources alone. Seeking closure, fulfillment, or worthiness through another person is temporary and ultimately leaves the individual facing the same consequences again and again. Each impulsive decision that prioritizes momentary relief over stability reinforces the pattern rather than correcting it. Repetitive cycles also shape expectations in relationships. When someone has repeatedly experienced instability, betrayal, or inconsistency, they may unconsciously accept it as normal or inevitable. Boundaries may be lowered, red flags ignored, and responsibility unevenly distributed because the pattern feels familiar and therefore safe in a distorted sense. This creates an environment where unstable relationships are more likely to occur, emotional labor is concentrated on one partner, and the outcomes of impulsive attachment, short-term decisions, and chemistry-driven bonds compound over time. The deeper the unhealed wound, the stronger the gravitational pull toward repetition. Breaking these cycles requires introspection, self-awareness, and intentional healing. Without it, the subconscious drives decisions, and patterns continue to repeat themselves. Emotional wounds are not punishment. They are signals that underlying needs have been neglected. Until these signals are addressed, behavior remains reactive rather than intentional, and relationships continue to reflect the unresolved pain of the past. This is why the same dynamics, moving fast, choosing thrill over reliability, prioritizing chemistry over character, tend to appear repeatedly. They are not accidents. They are reflections of internal gaps being projected onto external relationships. The intersection of unresolved emotional wounds with impulsive attachment, short-term thinking, and the prioritization of excitement over character explains why many relationships fail, and why responsibilities often become concentrated on the partner who invested most emotionally. Each cycle reinforces the previous one, creating predictable patterns of instability, heartbreak, and unforeseen outcomes. The unresolved pain drives behavior, shapes attraction, and influences the perception of partners, ultimately setting the stage for recurring challenges and outcomes that mirror past experiences. The continuous loop of emotional wounds, impulsive attachment, and decisions driven by thrill rather than alignment demonstrates that relationships are rarely random. They are the reflection of inner states projected outward. Without addressing the wounds at their root, the patterns repeat, and the consequences, emotional, practical, and sometimes parental, follow predictably, showing how internal psychology shapes external reality in ways that are difficult to escape.